Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. The Book of Knowledge. The Book of Knowledge, Chapter G. Just about the third page, I'm going to talk about Galileo, 1564 to 1642. 1564 to 1642. How many years is that? Almost 100 years, 80 years. Now let me count. 64, 6, 6, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30. No, never mind. Yeah, maybe 60, 70 years. For most of his life as a scientist, Galileo was engaged in a struggle with a man who had been dead for almost 2000 years. The man was Aristotle, the greatest scientist of the ancient world. Okay, he struggled for 2000 years. He struggled with a man that had been dead for 2000 years, Galileo. He was struggling with the man called Aristotle, the greatest scientist of the ancient world. In Galileo's day, Aristotle's writings on science were accepted as absolute truth. Absolute truth! Writing on science, wow. Yet, in fact, Aristotle had made many errors. Aristotle has made many errors, but there was once his science were accepted as absolute truth. Many of his views would not stand up under questioning, or many of his views would not stand up under questioning. Question everything. And questioning was Galileo's approach to science. He said. Now if I could insert a laser 700, laser beam 700, how am I going to say? Let me see. I've got to write the pen up on this, because it goes like no. If it wasn't for Aristotle, how would Galileo know what is the truth? He was questioning everything about it, so he questioned himself and questioned the truth. Okay, now mine. So basically, where was I? In fact, Aristotle had made many errors. Many of his views would not stand up under questioning, and questioning was Galileo's approach to science. It was an approach that Aristotle himself would have approved, but Galileo had to deal with men who objected to any questioning of the ancient authorities. What's this? It was an approach that Aristotle himself would have approved, but Galileo had to deal with men who objected to any questioning of the ancient authorities. Galileo had to deal with men who objected to any questioning. So they prevented any questioning of the ancient authorities. Or the ancient authority is draconian, what do you call it? Compression? Depression? I can't remember the word anyway. Fortunately for modern science, Galileo was not easily discouraged. Don't be easily discouraged. If you believe in the truth, you had to fight for the truth. Galileo Galilei was born in Pisa, Italy, Italiano, on February 15, 1564. 1564, I couldn't fathom how long ago. Mario 64. February the 15th. February the 15th, okay. His father, Vincenzo Galilei, was a composer and theorist. What's a composer and what's a theorist? Vincenzo had high ambitions for his son. He wanted Galileo to be a doctor. When Galileo was a young boy, the family moved from Pisa to Florence. He receives his early education in a nearby monastery. The monks and the religious people is where education is being taught. Then in 1581, He was sent to the University of Pisa to study medicine. Wow. He studies medicine. Galileo had little interest in medicine and found his classes boring. He don't like them drugs though, that Zaza, man. That cannabis is some sort of medication, the THC, the CBD. And he don't like that shit. Tell me what he's been smoking. Galileo is not smoking Zaza though. But his active and curious mind led him to the world of science. He stayed active and he stayed curious. One day while sitting in the Cathedral of Pisa, Galileo noticed the oil lamps swinging overhead. He noticed the oil lamps swinging overhead. Some were swinging in higher arcs than others, more frequencies. Galileo expected the lamps with wider arcs to take longer to complete their swings than those with smaller arcs. The longer it is, the shorter it is. When he timed the swings against the beat of his pulse, he found that they all looked the same amount of time. They all took the same amount of time. Beat of his heartbeat, and they all took the same amount of time. After experimenting at home, he worked out the laws that govern a pendulum. Galileo used his findings about pendulums to invent a timing device. More important, however, he had set the pattern of his life. A simple observation led to questions and experiments. A simple observation led to questions and experiments, which led to new knowledge and applications. Galileo left medical school without becoming a doctor and returned to Florence. He flunked his studies. He ain't no doctor, he don't love that Zaza, that cannabis. And he returned to his hometown, to Florence. By this time, he was in deep, serious studies of mathematics and science. He's not with biology or chemistry. He's more into mathematics and science, which is physics and mathematics. His writing on physics made him known, and he became professor of mathematics at the University of Pisa. Well, so quickly he's been cut short. All of a sudden, he's a professor now, and back in Pisa as a mathematics professor. Aristotle has stated that heavy objects fall faster than light ones. This seems true if you drop a coin and a sheet of paper at the same time. But heavier coin reaches the ground first. But this happens because the paper has a large surface, so the paper is held back more by the air. In a vacuum without air resistance, the coin and the paper would fall together. In a vacuum? How can you get a vacuum in 1600s? Because it was almost the end of 1500s. In working out the laws governing falling bodies, Galileo is said to have dropped balls of various weights together from the same height. Wow, Galileo has balls of steel, that's what I know. All reached the ground together, proving Aristotle wrong. I don't know, I can't imagine this. To measure the speed at which the balls fell, Galileo used a tilted board and inclined plane so that the balls would roll slowly enough to be timed. There were no clocks then, so Galileo let water from a bucket run into a measuring cup. Alright, it's Galileo. It says here, Galileo was famous for his studies of the laws of falling bodies and the laws of motion. He was the first person to use a telescope to make important discoveries about the planets and the stars in the Milky Way. You're telling me in the 1600s they discovered planets and stars in the Milky Way with a telescope? Now this is gassing people up. Too much gas in that Zaza though. Right. Thus he measured time by the height of the water in a cup. His questioning of Aristotle's ideas made Galileo unpopular, and he left Pisa. So Galileo started questioning Aristotle's ideas, and that made him unpopular. That made him even more popular, but they defamed him. He lost respect. He moved to the University of Padua, where he was free to teach and to do his research. Oh, Padua sounds like Purdue, alright? Using his knowledge of light and lenses, Galileo constructed the first of many telescopes in 1609, the early 1600s. When he used the telescope to look at the heavens, he saw that no one had ever seen before. He saw what no one had ever seen before. The Milky Way was actually composed of many stars. The moon was not, as people had thought, perfectly smooth. It had mountains and craters. Night after night, Galileo used his telescope to look at the wonders he had discovered. He's been discovering and exploring with observation. In January 1610, Galileo made one of his most important discoveries, the planet Jupiter. Planet Jupiter had moons that revolved around it. According to Aristotle and other ancient people, all things revolved around the earth. People still believe this, although some 60 years later, Copernicus had shown that the earth and planets circle the sun. Galileo's discovery showed that moons revolved around Jupiter, just as Copernicus has described our moon as circling the earth. This was the first evidence that supported Copernicus, and Galileo's description of his discovery gave the first public hint that he believed in the Copernican system. So Galileo is more inclined towards Copernicus, and he does not like Aristotle. A short time later, Galileo discovered that Venus, like the moon, went through phases. This could be explained only if Venus was revolving around the sun. The Church, as chief supporter of Aristotle, opposed the Copernican system. The Church. In 1611, however, Galileo visited Rome, where he was given a warm welcome by the Pope and other church officials. Galileo was welcome in Rome but not Italy. And the church officials in Rome actually were very impressed by his telescopes. They were particularly impressed by his telescope. How did he create the telescope? It's not written in his book. Galileo was now at the height of his fame, but he was soon to fall from favor. Everything he published seemed to support the Copernican system. His last such work was on sunspots, which he had a handful of other men had discovered. Then in 1616, the Copernican system was condemned by the church as an attack on its teaching. So they were impressed by the telescope, but his teachings were still despised by the church. Even in Rome. Wait, Italy, is Rome in Italy? The Pope ordered Galileo to stop supporting it. Galileo promised to obey. Well, they threatened his life, that's what's up. In the meantime, Galileo had left Padua for Florence, where he continued his other work. He studied magnetism. He worked on some of his inventions. He perfected the compound microscope. Magnetism is so interesting. And he perfected the compound microscope. I know compound bow. I don't know what's a compound microscope. Finally, he turned back to the Copernican system. He could not leave it alone. As a Catholic, he had no desire to quarrel with his church, but at issue was right of a scientist to seek the truth. In 1632, Galileo published Dialogue on the Two Chief Systems of the World, a clever book that consisted of a conversation among three men with different ideas about the universe. Galileo pretended not to take sides. Now you have to pretend, not pretend. You don't have to take sides first. First you cite A, then you cite B, then you cite C, then you cite A, then you cite B, then you cite C, then you come up with conclusion D. But there was no doubt that the winner of the argument was the man who supported the Copernican system. Galileo was called to Rome, imprisoned and forced to deny his belief. Galileo was called to Rome, in prison, not I'm prison. There's a typo in this book. And forced to deny his belief. He was allowed to return home, but only when he promised to stop writing on astronomy. Actually, these guys were very fascinated and impressed, but they had to stop him because they lose power. Galileo spent his last years confined to his villa near Florence by the order of the church, but he was allowed to teach. He carried on his research. He invented new instruments. He also wrote his great book on motion and mechanics, summing up his work in the field. He must be rich because there are so many peasants, there's so many fools, so many dummies and beggars. Galileo is rich. Just like Musk, you gotta be rich in order to afford research and learning. Through all these years, Galileo kept up his varied and lively interests. He had always been talented in many fields. He was an artist. He played the flute. But what's a lute? That's another typo here. And the organ. He wrote songs, poems, and literary criticism. Should be literature criticism. It says here literary criticism. Should be literary criticism. How do you call literature criticism? This and even his scientific writings were lively and witty in style, designed for a large audience. It is no wonder that he is one of the few people to become known to all of his first name, and there was only one, Galileo. Indeed, it was Galileo's way of writing that Galileo's way of writing that probably caused the most trouble between him and the authorities. Galileo was the first scientist to write in languages that ordinary people could understand. In an age where most scholars still wrote in Latin, Galileo chose to write his books in Italian. Oh, Latin, Italian. Is Latin Latino though? Or is Latin Latina? Galileo's many discoveries, theories, invention, and books are all important. But the main achievement is that he established for all time the need and the right of scientists to question. Above all, he insisted on searching for the truth. He was still searching when he died on January the 8th, 1642. Pitiful man, as if he didn't achieve much. I mean, his true biography could be even longer and even more in-depth detailed. As we know now, he had laid the groundwork for modern physics, and his search would be carried on by scientists like Isaac Newton, born the same year Galileo died. Isaac Newton, born the same year Galileo died. Wow, he just took up his footsteps as a baby. This is written by Patricia G. Lorber, author of The Quest of Galileo. Alright, that is the 2-page story in the Book of Knowledge, chapter G for Galileo. Thank you all for watching.